I'm here with Mike Lynch. Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about how long you've been at Sports Reference and what it is you do here?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Jonah. I'm the executive director of data here at Sports Reference, which I came to Sports Reference about 11 years ago now, I think it is. And yeah, it sort of involved with the data on all of our sites here. Basketball Reference is maybe, I'd love all of our sites, but I'd say Basketball Reference is maybe my favorite child in this case, just because I'm a huge NBA fan, huge basketball fan in general. I like almost all the sports that we cover a great deal, but that one's always been my favorite, probably.
Great. Yeah, that's why I wanted to talk to you today. We're going to be talking about VORP, which is one of the advanced stats on Basketball Reference. And for starters, for someone who has maybe seen the word VORP in a like a versus finder graphic, or has seen that stat on our table, but doesn't really understand what it is, how would you describe it to just sort of the average basketball fan?
Sure. So what VORP stands for is value over replacement player. And so, in the most general sense, what the stat should be telling you is like, how valuable this player is relative to a replacement player. In like this case, like a replacement player should be, like maybe like think of like a minimum salary player, or like someone who's on the roster but like not necessarily always in the rotation. Like maybe they get in if a game is a blowout one direction or the other, or like the sort of player that you might be able to sign to a two-way contract. So it's not the average player that is in the league, but it's the replacement player, which there's like a like subtle but important kind of difference there, in that a replacement player is in fact below average, because if they were average, well, they wouldn't be available. Average players are actually quite valuable, and the player that you can pull off the scrap heap is below average. And so what VORP is doing is like sort of putting numbers on what that value is. And couple of important things about VORP, which let me backtrack a little bit. So VORP is actually calculated off of a different stat that we have that is known as BPM, which that stands for box plus minus. Box plus minus is a rate stat per 100 possessions. VORP takes that rate stat and converts it into a counting stat by showing like how much better your BPM is than that replacement player, and then multiplying it by how much you're on the floor to like sort of come up with that number. A few other things about both of these stats is that they use only like info that can be found in a box score. And so what's in a box score? You've got points, rebounds, which are split between offensive and defensive, assists, blocks, steals, turnovers, three-pointers made is a useful piece because, it sort of shows how you impact spacing. And then, you're debited for things. I think that I already mentioned turnovers, but also personal fouls and shooting attempts, right? Like you get credit for your points, but you're debited for for how many shot attempts you use to score those points. I think that's like the basic sort of nuts and bolts of like what it's trying to do.
That's great. I want to dive into one thing about the replacement player before we move on, because this can sometimes trip some people up. When you say replacement player, you're talking about a hypothetical player, right? So, for example, if a player is on the Oklahoma City Thunder, the player who comes off the bench to replace them is quite good because the Thunder have a deep team. If they're on the Wizards, the player who comes in to replace them is quite bad. for this our stat for this purpose, that is not included in this, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Like, the replacement player is not like a literal player, and like, to be honest, like there's a chance that like the replacement player that you sign is actually like a gem, right? Like, I feel like the process Sixers are a great example of this. Like, they more or less for like some of those seasons, like nearly everyone that they were trotting out there was a replacement level player. Some of them, like Robert Covington, were actually sort of gems, that could contribute quite a bit to a team's defense. And then there's others who, they maybe played 5 or 10 games in their career, or in like some cases maybe a bit more, but those are more like the true replacement players. And so, for the purpose of VORP, it's like built off of BPM, and the replacement level player within BPM, which remember is box plus minus. It's shows player value on a per 100 possession basis. The replacement level for BPM is worth -2 points per 100 possessions. So like an average player would obviously be like 0.0, but the sort of assumption here, and I believe it was Tom Tango, the baseball sabermetrician, who came up with the replacement level that is used in BPM, is set at -2.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So kind of broadly speaking, what sorts of things would a player do? Would a player with a high BPM do, and what sort of things would a player with a negative BPM do? Right? Like, what are the things that, or if it helps, maybe what are some archetypes of players who do well and players who do poorly?
Sure. And so, it's pretty much exactly what you would think it would be. Like, the more good things that you do, in a box score, which is important to remember here, right? If you, I'll start with like what a good player is doing, that would lead to the BPM, and then maybe explain some of the blind spots too. It, it's like sort of obvious what the good things are that you can do in a box score, right? And that's anytime that you score, get a rebound, an assist, a block or a steal, or hit a three. Those are all going to contribute to a good BPM. What is going to hurt you are turnovers, personal fouls to a much lesser extent. And then the other thing that you can be sort of penalized for would be missed shots, right? Well, you're not going to miss any shots without sort of making them and scoring them. And so there's an important distinction to maybe mention here, in that high usage players are penalized less for relative inefficiency than low usage players, right? Like, if you are the DeAndre Jordan, right? You don't have a terribly high usage rate. Like, your offense is going to be all dunks that are created by someone else. You're not going to get any assists. You're not putting up huge scoring numbers. That this is sort of setting aside the fact that that he got a lot of blocks and rebounds. Like, we're talking about the usage piece here. If you're DeAndre Jordan, like, you better be shooting 70% from the floor, right? Which is what he did, to his credit. If you are, that there's like different offensive roles that are identified from looking at the box score stats. And so, this isn't to say that someone like Russell Westbrook was never penalized for, for his lack of efficient shooting, during his career, but it was muted to some extent by the fact that his usage was very high. If he was a low usage player shooting the percentages that he shot, he would have taken a larger penalty than what he did during his career, just because there's the more you have the ball in your hands, and are leaned on to create, there's like things like you're more likely to be the guy holding the grenade at the end of a shot clock, maybe, or that you're forced to take more difficult shot attempts, and that you create easier shot attempts for your like teammates. And so a player with like inefficient shooting is going to be penalized by BPM and VORP. But the penalty is stiffer for players who like don't seem to be having the ball much. Like, without looking at his numbers, I can't remember how bad his field goal percentages were, but like Andre Robertson, right? Like if he shot, say, 40%, I know his usage was really low. Well, he would be punished quite a bit. But a guy could have similar shooting numbers, but if his usage was very high, he wouldn't be directly sort of penalized for the shooting quite as much. But he would be penalized in like many like other ways if he was coming up short.
So let's try to talk about maybe some concrete numbers. So there was a lot of discussion about this year's MVP race. Nikola Jokic ended up with 9.8 VORP. SGA ended up with 8.9 VORP. Those numbers, 9.8 and 8.9, do those constitute like a meaningful difference? What is the scale of the stat, and how should we, as maybe a more casual fan, if we see VORP as 9.8, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so if I had an MVP ballot, I would not just sort of fill it out in order of VORP. I think it's definitely instructive. It's useful. Part of a larger picture, but like I would not say that like Jokic having a 9.8 and SGA having an 8.9 is like a large enough margin where you could conclusively say, oh, Jokic was definitely better this season than SGA was. With those, I think is like a rule of thumb. Like if you have, over a 7 or 8 VORP in a season, that in most seasons you're someone who should be strongly considered for MVP. And obviously when there's multiple players in that range, it becomes a little bit trickier. One thing that I will point out sort of that it would be pertinent to this discussion is that while VORP is just one number, it comes from BPM, as I mentioned previously, and BPM actually has two components. There's offensive BPM and there's defensive BPM. Again, all of this stuff is coming from a box score. And so as most basketball fans that have ever looked at a box score know, like the box score is going to nail who the good offensive players are, right? Like it's like very, there's not a lot of, there's some things, but there's not nearly as many things that you could do offensively that aren't captured in a box score compared to the defensive side of things. And so Jokic is an interesting case where defensive BPM absolutely loves him. Most fans perceive him as a horrible defender because he does not move particularly well. Compared to most centers, he's a very poor shot blocker. He gets a fair number of steals. I'm not someone that has grinded all of the film of him playing defense over the years. I sort of think that he's probably between those two extremes. Like he's not as bad as he looks because there's some value in just being big and eating up space, and the defensive rebounds that he gets certainly have some value too. But there's no way on earth that he is as good at defense as what DBPM thinks. And that's just because there's a limit to what is captured in a box score to let you know how good anyone is at defense. And so the margin for error on defensive box plus minus is much larger than it is for the offensive version. And that, both of those are feeding into VORP. And so like, I would not question someone saying, all right, VORP overstates the value of Jokic because he's not actually one of the best defensive players in the league. And so at that 9.8 to 8.9, I think what that is telling you is that you should look at both of these guys for MVP, but that you got to dig deeper to figure out who you would actually crown.
Yeah, and to give some some concrete numbers on that, for career defensive BPM, Jokic currently ranks second behind only David Robinson and ahead of players like Dennis Rodman and Draymond Green and players like that. So just some important context to keep in mind, which maybe is a good segue into this next question, which you kind of we've started talking about with Jokic, which are who are some players that VORP likes more than the consensus? Obviously, everyone likes Jokic, but VORP and BPM are especially high on him. And then are there players you can think of who it maybe likes less than fans would expect, or who the consensus is?
Yeah, so I get, as you mentioned, like Jokic's defense is definitely a case where BPM likes a player far more than like the consensus. And, I think it's, it handles most players appropriately, right? I think that Jokic's defense is an extreme example where DBPM is off. But it doesn't mean that the stat is not generally directionally right. The fact that it has like David Robinson up there, right? That Rodman is up there, that Draymond is up there, like it's getting most of these things right. But there's certain players who just give this the stat a very hard time. And Jokic's defense would be one of them. In terms of like other players who are probably like higher up there, sort of relative to where like the lay basketball fan would expect them to be. John Stockton would be one that comes to mind. And it's not necessarily unique to BPM. Advanced Stats love John Stockton quite a bit. And like a couple of the reasons on the VORP front, hyper efficient player. Like, man, you go back and you look at his shooting percentages, and it's really impressive. Didn't turn the ball over much for someone that could score, and obviously had some of the highest assist rates that you'll ever see. And then availability is the other huge thing here. Like John Stockton never missed games, played a lot of minutes, and is was really quite an outlier in that respect. His teammate Karl Malone, very similar. Like they are both way up on the all-time VORP leaderboard, which in many ways is largely a function of how many minutes they played. I don't think that either of them are nearly as high on the BPM leaderboard as they are for VORP, although they obviously had very good BPMs also. Like you couldn't just get on the VORP leaderboard by playing a lot. But Stockton would be like, I think he might be like in the top 5 all time for VORP, which, if you ask anyone, even the biggest John Stockton fan in the world, I don't think that anyone would tell you that that he was like one of the 5 best players that they've ever seen. Another thing I'll add, VORP only goes back to 1973, 74. So we're not, in that top 5, we're not including Russell, Chamberlain, Mike, and so on and so forth, just because up until 73, 74, blocks and steals and offensive rebounds were not part of a box score. Player turnovers didn't come into box scores until 77, 78. And so like for 73, 74, you just don't have quite as good of information to go on. As far as players underrated by VORP, I think it's like sort of a fitting comparison with Stockton is, there was the big controversy in 1992 that Stockton was picked to the dream team over Isaiah Thomas. And, was this Michael Jordan's thing that he didn't want to play with Isaiah? And, if you could go back in time to 1992, like there was maybe some debate about who was the better player in the moment. Like by 1992, Stockton was pretty firmly in his prime and Isaiah was winding down a bit. So, there's a fair argument that Stockton was better in that moment. But like through the 80s, that Isaiah was one of the best players in the world was like a pretty general consensus. And VORP just doesn't quite see him that way. Interestingly, like BPM and VORP highly regard Isaiah in the playoffs quite a bit. But in the regular season, it just there's some efficiency issues there for him that just the stat doesn't like him nearly as much as the general consensus. And like it's funny in a way to see some of the players that he's behind in VORP, like a lot of contemporaries who, I don't think that nearly any basketball fans would think that these guys were actually better than him, and that includes Terry Porter, who he played in the '90 NBA Finals. Maurice Cheeks is ahead of him. Cheeks is beloved in Philly, but I don't think, a great sort of defensive point guard, hyper efficient, because he was scoring at the rim all the time. But, at Isaiah, I would say that 98% of people would say that he was better than him. Jeff Hornacek is rated in front of him. And then some, like another sort of legendary Pistons point guard, Chauncey Billups, is in front of him. I would be curious for, I would think that most sort of Pistons fans would have no issue saying that Isaiah was better than Chauncey, although they love both of them, obviously. Kyle Lowry is another sort of more recent player who's rated ahead of Isaiah. And, listen, not to disparage any of the players that I just mentioned. They were all really, really good players who played for a long time. But I don't think that they are legends in the way that Isaiah was. And so he is one of those guys that I would say probably comes out a little bit lower rated than what you might expect.
So there's this whole constellation of advanced stats that BPM and VORP kind of fit into. There are additional ones on our website, like win shares. There are proprietary ones out there that you sometimes see going around. How does BPM and VORP kind of fit into this world and compare to the other advanced stats that people might be looking at?
Sure. Yeah. So BPM and VORP are two of my favorite advanced stats out there. And I think that their strength is, as we mentioned, this goes back to 1973, 74. So, we're talking about a lot of coverage, like over 50 years, we're talking roughly 2/3 of the history of the league here. You can pretty accurately assess the value of players over that whole span. So if you wanted to compare a modern player to someone who played in the 70s, or a player from the 90s to someone from the 70s, or two guys from the 80s, I think it's a great way to do that. I think that there are other metrics out there that for recent seasons are harnessing things like tracking data, play-by-play, matchup data, like all sorts of things that aren't captured in a box score that I have no doubt could be more exacting, particularly on defense. If you just wanted to look at the 2024-25 season, or compare, two guys from the last 5 years or so. But none of those stats can go back far enough to tell a story over a large part of the history of the league, which I think is where BPM and VORP are truly unique. Daniel Myers, who made these stats, that was a very big deal to him. He wanted to be able to calculate these using just a box score, knowing that all of this newer data was not available going further back, and figuring out where players fit in the history of the league is something that people enjoy talking about, that is important to lots of fans. And I personally think that BPM and VORP are the best stat that we have for this. Win shares goes all the way back to the beginning of the BAA in the late 40s. But it's not as robust of a stat as BPM is. If you need to make a comparison all the way back to the 40s, yeah, I think that win shares is the best in class for that. If you're more focused on, say, the 70s to the present, I think that BPM and VORP are the best that is out there. But then, if you're more focused on, say, the last 5 to 10 years, then yeah, that there are other stats that are harnessing all of this data that is available now that wasn't available then. That could be, they can use more precision to assess a player's value.
And of course, we're still all that stuff is so new that we're still trying to kind of understand what is signal and what is noise. And when you're looking at team, like plus minus one players on the floor that can be so heavily influenced by so many things that can be hard to attribute that. So the simpleness of VORP and BPM and kind of the fact that these are stats we know is one of the things I like about it. My last question for you is just as someone who's been on the data team for a long time and who's been kind of working on this stuff, are there any interesting stories that you have from your time here that relate to VORP, either sort of developments with the stat or at times you heard it used in a public setting that you thought, oh, that's cool that this seems to be getting traction or anything like that?
Yeah. So I guess one of the more interesting developments around BPM and VORP is so I should mention that the version of that is on our site today, we're having this conversation, what May of 2025, is BPM/VORP 2.0. There was a 1.0 that we launched sometime in the mid-teens that it was a great stat. It like passed the sniff test, worked very well. And then along came Russell Westbrook's MVP season when he averaged a triple double. And it just broke certain interactions between stats, whereby I believe that his original box plus minus for that season, I would need to check this to be certain. I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of like 15.6 or something like that. And that the record before that was like in the low 10, like maybe between 10 and 11, or like, very low 11 something. So it was, it set a record by, a very large factor. And while his season was, he had an incredible season, right? Especially in light of like what happened to set the stage for that season and how desperately the team needed him after a certain player left that team. And he won like MVP. So it's not like it was a bad season, but this season was not like better than any season that anyone had ever had by such a large factor, certainly. And so Daniel Myers, who I mentioned, he came up with this stat. He sort of went back to the drawing board a bit to try to sort of solve for this problem. Just in the play-by-play data that he had used to sort of like, so play-by-play is not used explicitly in the calculation of the data, but it was used to sort of figure out how certain box score stats contribute to like how well a team performs within a game. And the training data just didn't have anything like Westbrook's MVP season in it. And so if memory serves, it was the interaction between rebounds and assists that it just went crazy when it saw this player that was averaging, I don't know, 10 rebounds and 10 assists, which Jokic is now sort of making old hat. And Jokic, is putting up great BPM numbers, but not as insane as what Westbrook is doing. And then the like other piece there is there are credible claims that some of Jokic's seasons here are in fact maybe some of the best that anyone's ever had. Whereas Westbrook, I don't want to disparage what he's done. I don't think that anyone thought that his MVP season was maybe the greatest season that anyone's ever had, or like in the conversation for it. It was certainly warranted strong consideration to win MVP. I would not blame anyone for like voting for him to win that year, but like, it's not on the short list of greatest seasons ever or anything. And so Daniel Myers went back to the drawing board and came out with BPM 2.0, which is what is now on the site. It handles Westbrook's season a whole lot better. We chat still every now and again, and I know that he's even working on tweaks that he could make for the future, even now. So we could have a BPM 3.0 one day. It's not like on our list right now. I don't know if Myers has like found things that he like definitely wants to change, but like, you know, there's always evolution with how you can make these stats better. I want to thank Daniel Myers for like, you know, doing such a great job with BPM, because I feel like before that stat existed, it was very, very difficult to compare players from across eras. Like, 'cause I feel like win shares wasn't always quite satisfactory for that job in the way that BPM and VORP often are.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that like it's really like looking at those is really helping my appreciation of players of the past and like understand their games in context of the players that I'm watching today. So that's one of my favorite things about the historic depth of a stat like that, is that I can learn about these things that I was too young to kind of appreciate or even see in the moment. I think that's everything. Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to talk.
Thank you very much, Jonah. Glad to chat, and yeah, thank you.